I'm called upon to bring greetings from time to time, many times in fact. I'm called upon to introduce people from all walks of life. Sometimes they're little children, sometimes they're faculty members, board members, our trustees, and of course visiting guests. Today is especially special to have the opportunity to introduce Dr. Carson. Why do I say that? Because Dr. Carson got himself a big dream once. But he didn't just dream and have that dream turn into an illusion. He focused his energy and his attention. He worked hard. He stayed connected to a light source that was greater than himself. And because of that, he evolved and developed into one of the world's greatest, most respected, most renowned surgeons. So the person you see here is Benjamin Carson. But there's a Benjamin plus inside. And you will experience that when you hear him. You will feel that immediate connection to him when you hear him speak. I'm not going to stand here and read his bio to you. It's printed here so you can have it. But for the young people assembled here, our students, for the students from middle school, high school, elementary school, I would encourage you to get yourselves a dream. We just got finished with Dr. King's celebration. And we always ask, we talk about Dr. King's dream. And so the question I have for you today is, what is your dream? And Dr. Carson will talk about his dream. And in talking about his dream and his work, I'm sure that you will be energized to work a little harder, to read another book, to do more than the minimum in order to get your seat, but that you will develop all of your God-given talent. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Benjamin Carson.
Thank you very much. Thank you. It's a real pleasure to be here at NCCU. You know, it's a different meaning for me because at the hospital, the neurocritical care unit is called the NCCU. That's where all of our patients go. But I will have to think of it differently from now on. And my wife and I have certainly enjoyed being here and meeting some people. The president here has some connections with my wife's family, and always good to work on those as well. I want to talk a little bit today, and we are on sort of a very efficient schedule today. I must explain that to people, because in the end, when you see us running out, there's a reason for that. It's because our flight was canceled, and the Bureau has gotten another flight to fly us into Philadelphia and have a car pick us up and get us back to Baltimore because they have surgery in the morning. So they've got it all worked out, but we are on a tight schedule. I want to talk a little bit about human potential today and how we're able to accomplish it, and dreams. You know, when I was a youngster, I had a dream of becoming a physician. I love medicine. Anything that had to do with medicine, I was right there. If it was a television story, I was sitting right there. Radio, I was listening. I even like going to the doctor's office. That gives you some idea of how hooked I was. And going to the hospital was the best thing in the world, because we were on medical assistance. And we would have to wait for hours before one of the interns or residents could see us. Didn't bother me in the slightest, because I was in the hospital. And I would sit out in the hallway listening to the PA system. Dr. Jones, to the emergency room. Dr. Johnson. They sounded so important. And I'd be thinking one day they'll be saying, Dr. Carson, Dr. Carson. But of course nowadays we have beepers, so I still don't get to hear it. But it was important to have those dreams, because sometimes that's the only thing that will get you through some of those tough periods, is making sure you understand what your dream is and clinging to it. And dreams aren't always good, though. Sometimes, you cling to the wrong dream, it can have a bad outcome. I remember the case a number of summers ago of the Bajani twins. Some of you may remember that case. These were 29-year-old Iranian women who were joined at the head. Their lifelong dream was to be separated. And, they explored the whole world looking for a team that would take on such an incredible risk. I remember when I was first contacted about their case, and, I tried to discourage them and told them about twins that had survived, joined together, but they didn't want to hear that. And they eventually found a team in Singapore that was willing to undertake this very risky surgery. It was a team with which I had worked before, and they were able to convince me to come over and join them. And I must say, when I met those young women, I was very impressed. They had learned to speak English in only 7 months, if you can imagine that. And they were very intelligent, full of personality, vivacious. They both had college degrees. They both had law degrees. Only one wanted one, but they both had law degrees. So, they had a very good understanding of the risk that they were about to embark upon. And they said something to me that really impressed me. They said, "Doctor, we would rather die than spend another day stuck together." And that seemed kind of harsh to me. But then I put myself in their place and I thought about it. What if you were stuck 24/7 to the person in the world you like the most? You could never get away for 1 second. How long would you like them for? Think about that. And when I began to think about that, I began to understand exactly how they felt. Well, that operation did proceed, and we were about 90% finished. Some people were starting to celebrate. I wasn't among them because I knew there was going to be trouble. When we got to the very end of the operation, they began to bleed profusely, and they exsanguinated. They bled to death. So not everything we do is successful. And that's the case in a lot of surgical procedures. When heart transplants first started, kidney transplants, lungs, livers, dismal failures. But the key thing was learning from those things and moving forward. And that is really one of the keys to success in life. If something doesn't work, make sure you learn from that thing, and then you're able to move on. Thomas Edison said he knew 999 ways a light bulb did not work, which means he kept going. And eventually, they came up with it. Actually, it was his right-hand man, Lewis Latimer. Some of you might know who that is. He was an African-American. He was the one who actually came up with the filament that made the light bulb work for more than 2 or 3 days. He was the one who invented the electric lamp, did pioneering work in incandescent and fluorescent lighting, diagrammed the telephone for Alexander Graham Bell, was a tremendous inventor in his own right. Most people have never even heard of him. And it's actually a very good idea to go back and look at the history of many of the things that you take for granted. When you see a submarine, think about Henrietta Bradbury, a black woman who invented the underwater cannon, who made it possible to launch torpedoes from submarines. Most people don't know that. When you see the railroad tracks, think about Andrew Beard, who invented the automatic railroad car coupler, an African American, spurred on the Industrial Revolution. Or Elijah McCoy, the automatic lubrication system for locomotive engines. In fact, he had so many inventions, when something new would come out in the industrial arena, people would say, "Is that a McCoy? Is that the real McCoy?" That's where the term came from. You got racist people like David Duke talking about the real McCoy, don't even know who they're paying homage to. And, I could go on for an extensive period of time talking about things that you see every day, have no idea who invented them. And it's one of the reasons, really, that young men, particularly in this country, young black men, need to recognize that they have a very strong heritage of invention, of understanding of science. And don't shy away from that stuff. That's powerful stuff, and it requires a good brain and a lot of background. And never let anybody discourage you and tell you that science and math and things like that are difficult, because they're not, as long as you have the right foundation. Well, at any rate, learning from failure is such a powerful key. And I'm reminded of Walter Dandy. Walter Dandy was a very famous neurosurgeon at Johns Hopkins many decades ago. He was the first to try many things, including operating on the posterior fossa, the back part of the brain. Everybody thought the compartment was too small, it would swell, patients would die. But he operated on somebody with a lesion in their posterior fossa, and they died. And another, and they died, and another, and they died. The first 13 patients, they all died. Can you imagine how discouraged he must have been? I can't even imagine what he told the 14th patient when they said how the other 13 do. Probably said nobody's complaining. But, the fact of the matter is, he persisted. And now we're able to do those operations on a routine basis quite safely. And it was a matter of learning. And that's really a very, very key take-home point. Now, I just want to stop for a moment and make a disclaimer. These days everybody makes disclaimers. They say, well, I sit on this board, or, I'm paid by this group, and therefore you have to take everything I say with a grain of salt. Well, here's my disclaimer. I discovered not too many years ago that it is very difficult to speak to a large group of people today without offending someone. Have you noticed that? People are so sensitive today. When I was growing up, people used to say, sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. When's the last time you heard that? The young people probably never heard that. People are so sensitive. They walk around with their feelings on their shoulders. As soon as somebody says something, did you hear what they said? And then they can't hear anything else. I was talking to a group one time about the difference between a human brain and a dog's brain. And a man got offended. He said, you can't talk about dogs like that. And then, I was talking to another group about how the fashion industry has gotten the young women to think they're supposed to be so skinny they look like they escaped from a concentration camp. And a Jewish man got offended. He said, you can't talk about concentration camps. That's too sensitive. It would be as if I said something to you about slavery. I said, you can talk about slavery all you want. It doesn't bother me. But, some people just want to get offended. So, it is not my intention to offend anyone here today. And if anyone is offended, too bad. Because, I got to tell you, they follow the same path of self-destruction. That is a question for your generation. Because we have about one more generation on this path before we become toast, unless that corrective action is taken. You need to recognize something. The United States of America is a special nation. Has it made mistakes? Absolutely. Every nation has made mistakes. But there's never been a nation quite like this one before. This nation is the child of every other nation in the world. Therefore, it should have the interest of every other nation at heart. This nation was started by a bunch of ragtag militiamen able to defeat the most powerful empire in the world. Now think about that. Think maybe we had some help? Think maybe there was something special about the fact that the founding fathers had a strong relationship with God? And if you look at the writings of Jefferson and Adams and Washington and Franklin and see that relationship, you begin to realize that there was more to it than just a bunch of muskets and a bunch of men charging down a hill that allowed this nation to do that. And you think about World War II, nations falling like dominoes one by one, the whole world about to become victims of tyrannical powers, except for one thing. This nation, the United States of America, a nation that had the ability to send young men from the cities, the suburbs, the country, to fight a war on two different fronts of the world. A nation with the ability to send young women into factories to build more airplanes, tanks, and mortars than anybody could imagine. A nation that through its industrial might and determination changed the course of the world. A nation that rose to the pinnacle and did not try to conquer everybody else like all those other nations did. So yes, I will be the first to admit that this nation has made mistakes and will make mistakes, but it is the most benign superpower the world has ever known. And we have an opportunity to improve upon that and to make it into an even better nation. And for people to learn how to do what they once did in this nation, and that was to care about each other. There was a time in this nation where if somebody's fence blew down or their barn blew down, guess where all the neighbors were? Right over there helping them fix it. They weren't looking for a lawyer to see who they could sue. They were trying to fix the barn up. We need to get back to caring about each other. There was a time when people cared about the kids in the neighborhood. They cared about them. We've forgotten about that. And it has metastasized into our politics. And now we have people who demonize each other, and they think, you know, if you're in this party, you're evil. If you're in that party, you're evil. You know, this is horrible. And it's not the first time it happened, though. Those of you who are history majors, you know about the First Continental Congress? I see some hands there. First Continental Congress. The whole thing about being torn apart by dissension because the small states and the large states had different interests. They couldn't agree on anything. And as the whole thing was about to disintegrate, Benjamin Franklin stood in front of that great assembly and he said, "Gentlemen, stop. Let's get down on our knees and let's ask God to give us wisdom." And that whole assembly knelt down and they prayed. And when they got up, they were determined to come to consensus. They were determined to work together. It took them 60 ballots just to decide how to choose a president of the United States and many other things, but they were not leaving until they agreed, and they put together an incredible constitution that has withstood the test of time. And we need to get back to that. And a part of that is people need to be able to express themselves. They need to learn how to talk. But we don't need to have unanimity of opinion. We do need to have the ability to treat everybody's opinion with respect. And when we learn how to do that, it's going to make an incredible difference, because there is great safety in numbers. The Bible says, in a multitude of counselors, there is safety. Well, you know, fortunately for me, my mother believed in me when nobody else did. And she prayed to God and came up with an idea of turning off the TV set and making us read books. That didn't sound like a great idea to me, but it was for her. And of course, we didn't know that she couldn't read the book reports that she made us write. She would put little check marks and underline and highlight stuff. But you know, even though I hated the idea in the beginning, after a while, I began to like it. You know, we were desperately poor. But between the covers of those books, I could go any place, I could be anybody, I could do anything. I began to know things that nobody else knew. And in the space of a year and a half, I went from the bottom of the class to the top of the class, much to the consternation of all those students who used to laugh and call me dummy in the 5th grade. They were coming to me in the 7th grade and saying, Benny, how do you work this problem? I'd say, sit at my feet, youngster, while I instruct you. I was perhaps a little obnoxious, but it sure felt good to say that to those turkeys. But, you know, the key thing was, you know, I had a very different opinion of who I was. I had the same brain, I had the same talent, but a very different opinion of who I was. And you know, if you have a normal brain, think about this. You were created in the image of God, and God is no dummy. And he gave you a brain that is absolutely amazing. You know, the human brain, billions and billions of neurons, hundreds of billions of interconnections. It remembers everything you've ever seen, everything you've ever heard. It can process more than 2 million bits of information in 1 second. Think about that. How many of you remember your birthday? Let me just see your hand. Oh, okay, I think it's unanimous. Now, what did your brain have to do for you to respond to that question? give you an example of how sophisticated your brain is. First of all, the sound waves that leave my lips travel through the air, enter your external auditory meatus, travel down to your tympanic membrane, set up a vibratory force, which travel across the ossicles of the middle ear to the oval and round window, set up a vibratory force in the end of the limb, which mechanically distorted the microcilia, converting mechanical energy to electrical energy, which traveled across the cochlear nerve to the cochlear nucleus at the frontomedullary junction, from there to the superior olivary nucleus, ascending bilaterally up the brainstem to the lateral meniscus, to the inferior colliculus, and the medial geniculate nuclei, across the thalamic radiations to the posterior temporal lobes to begin the auditory processing, from there to the frontal lobes, coming down the tract of vestibular, retrieving the memory from the mid-hippocampal structures and the mammary bodies, back to the frontal lobes to start the motor response at the bet cell level, coming down the cortical spinal tract, across the internal capsule, into the cerebral peduncle, descending down to the cervical medullary decussation, into the spinal gray matter, synapsing there, going out to the neuromuscular junction, stimulating the nerve and the muscle. So you can raise your hand. And now, see if you can get one of those rap singers to do that. But that's the simplified version of what your brain had to do. I didn't want to get into all the coordinating and inhibitory influences. We've been here all day talking about that one little thing that your brain does in a split second. If your brain can do all that, and you barely have to think about it, can you imagine what your brain is capable of when you actually put your mind to something? It is really quite mind-boggling. Well, you know, when I began to understand these things, things began to move very, very, very quickly for me. And in no time, I found myself chief of pediatric neurosurgery at the #1 hospital in the nation. People would come from great distances to see Dr. Ben Carson, chief of pediatric neurosurgery. And I would walk in the room and they would say, when is Dr. Carson coming? You know, because they were expecting to see something else, you know. And I would say, well, I'm Dr. Carson. Some people would just about have a seizure, which is how I got interested in seizure surgery. But no, that's not how I got interested. But, you know, no one ever walked out. Once I began to explain to them what the problem was, what the solutions were, it became very apparent to them that I knew what I was talking about. And, you know, young people, don't ever be thinking, I'm going to do this and this and this when I get older. Now is the acceptable time. Now is the time to get these things done, you know? And you look at people who win Nobel Prizes in science and math, they usually don't get them until they're in their 50s, 60s, or 70s. But it's for work they did when they were in their 20s and their 30s. So, you know, don't ever be thinking about the future in that regard, because you right now have lots of energy and lots of intellect and can do a large number of things. Well, you know, I developed a reputation early on for doing a lot of daring things, and some people thought I was overly adventurous. I know one very well-known pediatric neurosurgeon said, Carson will operate on anybody who will lay down. Well, you know, they don't know this stuff gets back to me, but, you know, it's not true, because I would operate on people in the sitting position too. But now the fact of the matter is, I was actually very conservative, very careful, but I would do something that sometimes people didn't do. I would always ask questions like, what's the best thing that happens if I do this? And what's the worst thing that happens if I do it? What's the best thing that happens if I don't do it? And what's the worst thing that happens if I don't do it? And in many of those cases, it became clear that the only chance that person had is if I did something. And by praying and asking God to give me wisdom and using the talent that He had provided, many of those things turned out tremendously well. But it was a matter of taking stock and making sure that you develop the talent that God has given you. He's given you a lot, but He expects you to develop it. And that means spending a lot of time working extraordinarily hard. You know, I remember as a first-year medical student, I did poorly on my first set of comprehensive exams. I was sent to see my counselor. He looked at my record. He said, you seem like a very intelligent young man. I bet there are a lot of things you could do outside of medicine. And he tried to encourage me to drop out of medical school. He said, you're not cut out to be a doctor. and you're just going to torment yourself and everybody else. You've only wasted 6 weeks. We can get you into another discipline. Everybody will be much happier. Well, I wouldn't have been happier. And I went home and I just prayed and I said, Lord, you got to help me here. And I started thinking, I said, what kind of courses have you always done very well in? What kind of courses have you struggled in? And I realized I did very well in courses where I did a lot of reading. I struggled in courses where I listened to a lot of boring lectures. And there I was listening to 8 hours worth of boring lectures every day. So I just made an executive decision to skip the boring lectures and to spend that time reading. The rest of medical school was a snap after that. And when I went back to my medical school some years later as the commencement speaker, I was looking for that advisor because I was going to tell him he wasn't cut out to be an advisor. You know? Some people are just so negative all the time. They can always find reasons why you can't do something. They can't find reasons why you can do something. And with the kind of brains and the talent that we have, we can always find the reason that we can do it if we apply ourselves. And just in closing, what in fact is success? Is it a big house, a lot of cars, fancy titles? I don't think so. In 1997, when I was asked to come to South Africa to head up a team in an attempt to separate type 2 vertical craniopicus twins, those are Siamese twins joined at the top of the head, facing in opposite directions, I knew that was going to be a great medical challenge. 13 attempts had been made to do that previously, none of which were successful. But it was also going to be a great social challenge because it was going to be done at the Medical University of South Africa at Medunsa, the only major black teaching hospital in South Africa, always the stepchild throughout apartheid and in the post-apartheid period. This was going to be their chance to stand shoulder to shoulder with Cape Town and Johannesburg and all the other great universities. I wasn't ready for all that social pressure. I said, Lord, you're going to have to show me something here. Because greater and smarter people than me have tried and failed. And as I was studying their anatomy on our three-dimensional workbench at Johns Hopkins, this has the ability to integrate the MRI, the CAT scan, the angiograms into a 3D image. You put your goggles on and you can actually study the vessels. And I realized that the central drainage system was narrow. And the traditional neurosurgical literature said you should decide which twin to give the drainage system to, and then divide them over the course of several operations, separated in time by weeks to months to allow collateral circulation to develop. Well, I felt strongly that if we concentrated on the area where it was narrowing down, we could do it all in one operation. When I explained it to the team, they said, you're the boss, we'll do whatever you want to do. I remember going into that operating room 2 days before New Year's of '98, big sign over the door that said, God bless Joseph and Luca Banda. They were having song service and prayer service. I was thrilled. I said, can we bring in a stereo system to play inspirational music? 19 hours into that operation, we were only 3/4 of the way finished. The part that remained was so complex. The blood vessels were engorged. They were entangled. They were adhesed. It looked impossible. We stopped the operation. We went into conference. I suggested we could cover the area over with skin and come back in a few months, and they would have developed enough collaterals that we could cut through all those vessels. And the doctors from South Africa and Zambia said, that's a great idea. And I know it would work at Johns Hopkins. But we don't have the ability to keep partially separated twins alive. They'll die. Now I really felt the weight of the world on my shoulders. I didn't have all my fancy equipment that I have at Hopkins. I had my scalpel, my loops on, a prayer on my lips, and I said, Lord, it's up to you. Started cutting between those vessels that were so thin you could see the anesthetic bubbles coursing through them, just daring you to make a nick. Make a long story short, when I made the final cut that separated those twins, over the stereo system came the Hallelujah chorus, and everybody had goosebumps. And we finished that operation after 28 hours. One of the twins popped his eyes open and reached up for the endotracheal tube. The other one did the same thing by the time we got to the ICU. Within 2 days, they were extubated. Within 3 days, they were eating. Within 2 weeks, they were crawling. And now they're in the 6th grade doing perfectly fine. But that wasn't the success. The success, you had to be there to witness the reaction of the people. This was done in their hospital. This was done in their country. They were literally dancing in the streets. Their level of pride and self-esteem was so high. And that's what I think real success is all about, is using the talent that God has given you to elevate other people. And that's what I mean. That's what I mean when I say think big. Each one of those letters means something special. The T is for talent, which God gave to every single person, not just the ability to sing and dance and throw a ball. Nothing wrong with those things, by the way. But intellectual talent, that's what we must emphasize. The H is for honesty. Lead a clean and honest life. You don't put skeletons in the closet. You put them there, they always come back to haunt you. If you always tell the truth, you don't have to try to remember what you said three months ago. The I is for insight. Learn from those who've gone before you. Learn from their triumphs, learn from their mistakes. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can go much faster if you can learn from somebody else. The N is for nice. Be nice to people. Because once they get over their suspicion of why you're being nice, they'll be nice to you. And you can get so much more done when you're being nice and they're being nice. And can we all take the niceness pledge? Just raise your hand right where you are, all hands up. If the person beside you doesn't have their hand up, you may kick them, okay? Because after this, you have to be nice, okay? Now, you can put your hands down. What did you just agree to do? For 1 week, to every single person you encounter, that includes family members, roommates, everybody, okay? Now, let me tell you what that means. That means no talking about people behind their back for a week. I realize some people will stroke out. I understand that, okay? See somebody struggling, you're going to help them. Men, it means we're bringing chivalry back. We're opening the doors for the ladies and holding the chairs for them, okay? Ladies, it means you're not cursing them out when they do that, okay? Now, also means if you're getting on the elevator and there's only one spot left, you're going to let somebody else get on. And when you're on the elevator, you're not going to act like you never saw the numbers change before. Speak to people. You know, you may have to practice CPR, but speak to them. Speak to janitors, speak to maids, speak to people you walk by and act like they don't exist. Because they do exist and they have feelings. And what would your life be like if they weren't there? Talk to them. You're going to get in your car, if you have a car, and the parking lot is jam-packed, and you see 3 people following you in their car because they want your space. When you get in the car, you're not going to open the glove box and pull down the mirror. Just get out of the space and let them have it. You don't have to revel in your power, you know. But what are you doing during that week? Thinking of others first. What kind of community? What kind of nation? What kind of world could we have if people thought of others first? Why are we still acting like they did in the days of Genghis Khan? Why are people still running around shooting each other and acting like heathen? This is 2010. We have got to move this to a different level. We got to stop acting like little ants and things, you know? It's crazy. The K is for knowledge, which is the thing that makes you into a more valuable person. Do I have a big house? Yes. Do I have a lot of cars? Yes. I grew up in Detroit. I like cars. A lot of the things that Robin Leach thinks are important, yes. Are they important? No. They mean nothing. If they all disappeared tomorrow, it doesn't matter. You know why? Because I can get them all right back almost immediately with what's up here. And that's what Solomon, the wisest man who ever lived, meant when he said, gold and silver and rubies are nice, but be treasured far above those things, knowledge, wisdom, and understanding. Because with those, he knew that you get all the gold and silver and rubies you want. More importantly, you come to understand those things don't amount to a hill of beans. And that the most important thing is developing your God-given talent to the point where you become valuable. The B is for books, which is the mechanism for obtaining that knowledge. And it's never too late. You know, my mother did teach herself to read eventually. She got her GED. She went on to college in 1994, got an honorary doctorate degree. So she's Dr. Carson now too. So it's never too late. The second I is for in-depth learning, learning for the sake of knowledge and understanding, as opposed to superficial learning. Those are people who cram before a test. Sometimes they do okay, and 3 weeks later they know nothing. We really cannot afford that. Moving further into the information age, we have got to be solid learners. No skating by, no shucking and jiving. You got to know your stuff, you got to know it solidly. And the last letter, G, is for God, who is becoming politically incorrect in our nation. Some people don't want him here anymore. That is a huge mistake. You know, lawyers came to us a few weeks ago, my wife and I, and they said, you can't put your Think Big banners up in public schools because the G stands for God. And the First Amendment says there can be no government support of religious expression. Well, I reminded them that the First Amendment also says there can be no government suppression of religious expression. So we had a rather vigorous argument. And I suggested that we resolve it at the level of the Supreme Court, which seems like a bold and reckless statement, but it really wasn't. You see, because I knew the very next week I was going to the Supreme Court to receive the Jefferson Award. So I figured I would ask while I was there, and I did. Justice Sandra Day O'Connor said they were all wet. They had no idea what they were talking about. They had no idea what separation of church and state meant. Of course you could put that up in a public school without violating anything. And people who say silly stuff like that, what do they really know about the founding of our nation? Do they realize that our Declaration of Independence, our founding document, talks about certain inalienable rights given to us by our Creator, a.k.a. God? Do they realize that the Pledge of Allegiance to our flag says we are one nation under God? That most courtrooms in the land on the wall, it says, in God we trust, every coin in our pocket, every bill in our wallet says, in God we trust. So if it's in our founding document, it's in our pledge, it's in our courts, and it's on our money, but we're not supposed to talk about it, what in the world is that? In medicine, it's called schizophrenia. It's a form of craziness. And doesn't that explain a lot of what's going on in our nation today? And we need to make it perfectly clear that it's okay to live by godly principles of loving your fellow man, of caring about your neighbor, of developing your God-given talents to the utmost so that you become valuable to the people around you, of having values and principles that govern your life. And if we do that, not only will we remain a pinnacle nation, but we will truly have one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Carson. Thank you so much. A special thanks to